Check 1 2, mic check. Did you get that? Microphone check, test 1 2, mic check 1 2 3. Audio test 1 2, 1 2 3 4 5. Check 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 1 2.
Check 1 2, check check check.
The velvety sound. Whoever talking.
The subcommittees will come to order, and this is an important meeting of two subcommittees, the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations, and Subcommittee on Middle East and North Africa. We're joined by our very distinguished chairwoman of that committee, who is also chairwoman emeritus of the full committee, and has been absolutely with a laser beam focus, looking at issues pertaining to and related to Iran for the entirety of the last decade or more. So I want to thank her for her leadership. At our full committee hearing on Tuesday, full Foreign Affairs Committee, I asked Secretary of State John Kerry whether he had raised Pastor Saeed Abedini's release during the Iranian nuclear talks. I read him the following advance excerpt of the testimony of Naghmeh Abedini, wife of Pastor Saeed Abedini, who is our very distinguished witness this morning, and as we all know, who remains imprisoned and subject to torture in Iran. And this is what she said in pertinent part, and this is what I had read to the Secretary of State. Quote, "While I am thankful for President Obama's willingness to express concern about my husband and other imprisoned Americans in Iran," she said, during his recent phone conversation with Iran's President Hassan Rouhani, "I was devastated to learn that the administration didn't even ask for my husband's release when directly seated across the table from the leaders of the government that holds him captive." She went on to say, "My husband is suffering because he is a Christian. He is suffering because he is an American. Yet his own government, at least the executive and diplomatic representatives, has abandoned him. Don't we owe it to him as a nation to stand up for his human rights and for his freedom?" Secretary Kerry acknowledged that he had not done that. He had not raised it in the negotiations with the Iranians on the nuclear issue, confirming the awful report that Naghmeh had already heard. So as we speak, Pastor Abedini remains imprisoned in Iran, sharing a cell with violent criminals who have more than once surrounded Pastor Abedini as he tried to sleep, wielding knives and threatening his life. Pastor Saeed Abedini is an American citizen. He went to Iran last year to build an orphanage for Iranian children. He has been arrested in Iran before, but released and told he could enter and exit the country for humanitarian aid work if he agreed to cease pastoring house churches. As Pastor Abedini's wife, Naghmeh, will testify today, he accepted that proposal, but Iran did not uphold its end of the agreement. Pastor Abedini was arrested in July of 2012, imprisoned and tried for sharing his religious beliefs and thereby supposedly undermining the security of Iran. Imagine that. You share the good news of the gospel and you threaten the security of Iran. But even that he was not doing. He was there to establish an orphanage. He was denied contact with his attorney until just before the trial. The trial was not public, and he and his attorney were barred from participating in key portions of the trial, following which a judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison. His appeals have been denied. In prison, he has been repeatedly beaten, denied medical care, and held in solitary confinement. While nuclear talks played out on the world stage, Iran moved Pastor Abedini to a prison notorious for housing the worst criminals in Iran. It's called Rajeh Shar. The very fact that Pastor Abedini was moved to a more dangerous prison than the one he was at previously was certainly dangerous itself, in the middle of the negotiations confirms that the Iranians recognized him as a potential factor in the negotiations. Since August of 2012, the U.S. has reportedly released 4 Iranians, including most recently a high-ranking scientist who were imprisoned in the U.S. for sanctions violations. Speaking for myself, I question whether these releases are unrelated to the nuclear talks. Were they allowed out in order to create a better atmosphere so the talks could go forward? And yet, American citizen Saeed Abedini remains in an absolute hellhole prison in Iran. The U.S. government must not waste another opportunity to secure the release of this brave and courageous father of 2 and devoted husband and a great pastor. His case needs to be front and center in the next round of U.S.-Iranian negotiations. Time is running out. Naghmeh, Rebecca, Jacob need their husband and father home, and they need him home now. I'd like to yield to the distinguished gentlelady, Mr. Higgins? Okay, sure. To the chairwoman of the subcommittee, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Smith, and we are blessed in Congress to have a leader of human rights with the passion, the intelligence of Chris Smith. We thank him for his ongoing and relentless pursuit of liberty throughout the world and respect for human rights. And we're so honored also to look upon this beautiful portrait of our former chairman, Tom Lantos, and Chris Smith and Chairman Lantos were a great team. And but he's still with us, and we're so fortunate to have one of his daughters carrying on his work. And I'd like to thank Mrs. Abedini for joining us today. Our thoughts and our prayers are with you. They're with your family, your husband, and we commend you for your determination and perseverance to obtain his release. Last month, our Middle East and North Africa Subcommittee and then the full Foreign Affairs Committee, as you know, unanimously passed House Resolution 147, calling on the Iranian regime to immediately release Pastor Saeed and condemning the regime's ongoing persecution of religious minorities. And this resolution sends a strong message on behalf of Pastor Saeed, his family, and the Iranian people whose human rights suffer under this brutal regime. And this bill states that we stand with them in solidarity. We will continue to press for Pastor Saeed's release, and it calls upon the government of Iran to respect the rights of its citizens. And although we are here to discuss in particular the plight of Pastor Saeed, we must also highlight that there are other Americans languishing in Iran's prisons or are being held captive by the regime, like South Florida resident and a constituent of Congressman Ted Deutsch, the ranking member of our subcommittee, and that is Bob Levinson. Last month, Bob became the longest-held American hostage in history, now in captivity in Iran for over 6 years. Earlier this week, I joined as a co-sponsor of House Resolution 435, introduced by Ranking Member Deutsch, which calls for Iran's cooperation and the immediate return of Bob Levinson. So we're here today because Rouhani's empty promises aren't only about Iran's nuclear programs, but about the reforms that he promised, which have gone unfulfilled as the regime continues its policy of systematic and widespread suppression of human rights. On the campaign, Rouhani's charming words indicated that the regime would ease its repression of social freedoms and human rights. However, we must judge this regime not by its words, but by its actions, and in this regard, it has utterly failed. Since Rouhani took office, the rate of executions in Iran has sharply accelerated, with more than 300 executions carried out since August alone. And on September 2012, Pastor Saeed Abedini, an American citizen, was convicted on bogus charges, imprisoned after being accused by the regime of undermining national security. But his only so-called crimes were what? Working to establish an orphanage and practicing his Christian faith. He was supporting and ministering to churches in private homes, one of the only places in Iran where Christians and other religious minorities can practice their faith despite the fear of state persecution. In August, Pastor Saeed's unjust 8-year sentence was upheld, and last month, as we know, he was transferred to a brutal prison reserved for Iran's most violent criminals, where his life is in constant danger. Sadly, the plight of Pastor Saeed is not an isolated incident, but it's symptomatic of the Iranian regime's hostility toward religious minorities. In October, 4 Iranian Christians were sentenced to 80 lashes for drinking sacramental wine during communion. And this past summer, an Iranian Christian convert was sentenced to 10 years in prison for distributing Bibles. And it's not just Christians who are persecuted, but others, including Muslim minorities and reformers, who also suffer for their beliefs. For example, the Baha'i community is systematically targeted and persecuted by the regime, and more than 100 members of this community and its leadership are imprisoned. In fact, under Iranian law, Baha'i members can be killed with impunity. For these flagrant violations, the U.S. has designated Iran as a country of particular concern since 1999, a regime that does not respect the fundamental human rights of religious freedom. For many persons, this is a central aspect of their identity and of their life. This is a country that won't respect other freedoms. We saw this when the regime crushed the freedoms of speech and assembly during the Green Revolution of 2009, when the administration sadly missed a critical opportunity to express support for the Iranian people. I was a lead sponsor of the Iran Threat Reduction in Syria Human Rights Act that was signed into law last August, which expanded sanctions related to human rights abuses in Iran. And though the administration has selectively applied some of these sanctions, more needs to be done. We must enforce all of the sanctions, including travel bans, asset freezes on regime officials responsible for committing human rights abuses. If the international community doesn't hold this regime accountable, no one will. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how we can help bring Pastor Saeed home, reunite him with his wife and his children where he belongs. And I thank the chairman again for holding this important hearing.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Ross-Layton, for your very eloquent statement, and again for your leadership on all things pertaining to Iran. Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Madam Chairman, for calling this hearing. And thank each of you for being here, and for some of you who we've had here before, thank you for fighting for those who many times don't have a voice. And so I've got an opening statement, but I'm going to speak probably more from the heart instead of going to that. Right now we're in a critical time. We have negotiations going on with a country that, quite frankly, is not built on a foundation of trust. We don't trust them. They don't trust us. And yet here we are fundamentally dealing with an issue with Pastor Saeed Abedini and his detainment and imprisonment in a situation that we would find just deplorable. But more importantly, the message that is not getting out, because so many times when we think of people in prison, we think of them there for just cause. And had the opportunity to look into this in detail. And yet here's a man who agreed with the intelligence ministry not to conduct a particular activity from many years ago, would be granted to be able to come back and forth and work to establish an orphanage that was sanctioned by the Iranian government. And so here he was supposedly working with the government under their approval, and yet he is tried and convicted and put in prison, but really not even with due process. So we're embarking right now on a situation where we are working with a nation on something far greater than that with regards to a nuclear agreement. And that can only be negotiated based on mutual respect and trust. And yet the foundation of trust has been violated with this particular situation, and it's not being rectified. Over 444 days without a husband and a father. How many more Christmases are going to come and pass where this injustice is not rectified? If there is any message that Foreign Minister Zarif and the Iranian government, if they want to have a message of trust and mutual respect, this request of releasing this individual at a minimum would say we are trying to negotiate in good faith, and it would send messages to the entire nation that they want to operate in good faith. And so I think the message needs to be that if they cannot release this individuals and others held without due process, then how are we to trust them on much greater positions that have national and international consequences? I'd ask, Mr. Chairman, that my full opening statement be submitted for the record, if possible.
Ms. Meadows, thank you very much. Chair recognizes Mr. Shabbat, the chairman of the Asia and Pacific Subcommittee. We have 4 subcommittee chairmen here today. Again, a testament to the concern that is shared across the aisle and throughout the entire House of Representatives. Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you. I'll be brief. I commend Chairman Smith and Russ Leighton for holding this timely hearing today. In light of recent developments in U.S.-Iranian relations, the case of Pastor Saeed Abedini, the imprisonment raises very grave concerns. If Iran expects to engage in a more transparent and honest relationship with the U.S. and other members of the global community, it must cease its egregious human rights abuses and adopt standards practiced by most of the civilized world. I think my colleagues would agree that the imprisonment of Pastor Abedini is a prime example of Iran's use of abhorrent practices to deny human rights protections to its religious minorities. If the Obama administration is going to negotiate with Iran concerning economic sanctions, the release of Pastor Abedini must be a priority. It should have been a precondition of negotiations from the start. And I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Shabbat. Ranking Member Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thanks for hosting this hearing on Pastor Abedini, detained American citizens, and the broader human rights situation in Iran. I also want to thank our witnesses, especially Ms. Abedini, for being here today. Please know that Congress is committed to bringing your husband and all 3 detained Americans home as soon as possible. Our legislature is divided on many issues, but I am proud to say that Congress has been and always will be united in its support for international religious freedom and for protecting Americans overseas. That's why I am proud to support legislation from Mr. Cassidy that calls for the release of Pastor Abedini and condemns the government of Iran for its persecution of religious minorities. At a time when Iran is seeking to re-engage with the international community, its ongoing persecution of Pastor Abedini is utterly deplorable. His arbitrary arrest and complete lack of due process is bad enough, but his transfer to a more dangerous prison that is filled with Iran's most violent criminals demonstrates why the United States must do everything in our power to end his continued and unjust imprisonment. Unfortunately, Pastor Abedini's persecution is just the latest in a string of appalling actions the Iranian regime has taken against American citizens. Mr. Amir Hekmati has also been unfairly detained in Iran for more than 2 years. And Iran is also suspected of having significant knowledge about the whereabouts of my constituent, Robert Levinson. As many of you know, in March of 2007, Mr. Levinson was taken hostage while visiting Iran's Kish Island. A retired FBI agent, husband, father to 7 children, and grandfather of 2, Mr. Levinson has missed 6 years' worth of birthdays, anniversaries, weddings, and other milestones. November 26th was his 2,455th day in captivity, making him the longest-held American hostage in our history. In response to his situation, this week my colleague and friend, Ms. Ross Leighton, and I introduced H.Res. 435, urging Iran's government to cooperate in his case and return Mr. Levinson home to his family as soon as possible. Yet, Iran's egregious human rights record is not limited to American citizens, nor is its vile mistreatment of its people new. Iran routinely imposes severe restrictions on expression, association, and assembly. Political activists and human rights defenders are routinely and arbitrarily arrested. Torture is common and is committed with impunity. Women, religious and ethnic minorities, and members of the LGBT community are all routinely persecuted. Since taking office, President Rouhani has spoken about the need to repair Iran's relationship with the world and to ensure the rights of his people. Unfortunately, this rhetoric has not been matched with action. Hundreds of political prisoners remain in prison, including former presidential candidates Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi, who recently spent their 1,000th day under house arrest. This year alone, more than 500 Iranians have been executed, yielding Iran's highest number of executions ever and a rate that doubles Ahmadinejad's last year in office. And in the past few months, there has been a stunning wave of repression targeting the media and civil society, that including banning of prominent reformists daily and the arrest of a number of prominent political actors. All of this shows that Iran continues to flagrantly violate basic human rights and is doing nothing to uphold Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of which it is a signatory, that guarantees the right to freedom, religion, conscience, and thought. While most of the world is focused on a nuclear deal with Iran, today provides a timely opportunity to remind the people of Iran that we stand with them in their quest for dignity and for freedom. Preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons capabilities is our paramount objective, but it must not impact our support for human rights in Iran. We must continue to press Iran to treat their people with due process, and we must act to ensure the release of all political prisoners, including Pastor Abedini, Amir Hekmati, and Robert Levinson. This hearing is an important step in this process, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deutsch. Mrs. Walorski, Congresswoman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Chairman Ross Layton, for allowing me to sit in on your committee today. I appreciate it. It's a very gracious offer. This case is one of great personal importance to me, and I'm grateful to all the witnesses for being here today. Mrs. Abedini, my family and I pray for you every day and for your husband. My husband and I spent 4 years as missionaries in Eastern Europe, involved in orphanage ministry as well, and we appreciate your heart and can relate to your heart, and we appreciate that. I'm a co-sponsor of the resolution calling for your husband's release. I've signed on to multiple letters on his behalf, and frankly, I am deeply embarrassed, which is why I wanted to be able to come and sit in on this hearing today. Congress should not have to urge the administration to act in a case like this, which involves a state sponsor of terrorism imprisoning an American citizen, and I'm deeply disappointed. The release was not a prerequisite for any Iranian peace deal. Once again, I'd like to publicly urge our President and Secretary Kerry to do everything they can to secure the release of not only your husband, but the other Americans being held as well. And I would also say that I am deeply, profoundly impacted by the increase in religious persecution under President Rouhani, as we in this country so deeply value religious freedom and believe in religious-free persecution around the world, that people should be able to hold their beliefs and be able to express their religious opinions as well. So I would just like to thank you for being here today and offer my support. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to graciously sit on your committee.
Thank you, Ms. Walorski. The chair recognizes the distinguished gentlelady from New York, Ms. Meng.
I'd like to thank our subcommittee chairs and ranking members for calling today's important hearing. We must keep our attention on the persecution of Pastor Abedini and insist that our government officials demand his release in all meetings they have with their Iranian counterparts. Each and every human life is precious, and as members of Congress, we have a particular duty to look out for our citizens who are persecuted and wrongly jailed in distant lands. The Ayatollahs in Iran must know where we stand and must know that we view their continued mistreatment of Pastor Abedini as indicative of a lack of good faith on a range of other issues. Here in Congress, we will do whatever is in our power to bring back your husband, Mrs. Abedini, Amir Hekmati, and Robert Livingston back home to their families here in America. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Meng. I'd like to recognize Chairman Frank Wolf, and just before I do, note that last March, Chairman Wolf, as chairman of the Lantos Commission, welcomed Ms. Abedini to the Congress, and she made a point at that hearing that the State Department had said there's, quote, nothing that they could do. Chairman Wolf's hearing was a catalyst for at least some engagement and some high-level response, and I want to thank the chairman for that. And I would also note parenthetically that Dr. Sweat is the vice chair of the Commission on International Religious Freedom. That commission was created by Mr. Wolf's bill, the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, so we do have an expert here and a man who really made a huge difference, and I recognize Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no comments. I just wanted to welcome the witnesses and say hello to Mrs. Abedini. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would like to now, without any further, just welcome our very distinguished witnesses, beginning first with Dr. Katrina Lantos Sweat, who is the Vice Chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, an independent U.S. government commission that monitors the universal rights to freedom of religion or belief abroad. She established the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice in 2008 and serves as its president and chief executive officer. This organization is proudly carrying on the unique legacy of her dad, the late Congressman Tom Lantos, with whom many of us served, and we're very, very honored to call him friend. She currently teaches human rights and foreign policy at Tufts University and has also worked on Capitol Hill as a consultant. We'll then hear from Naghmeh Abedini, wife of Pastor Saeed Abedini. She is a U.S. citizen and was born in Iran and moved to the United States with her family when she was 9. Her husband, Pastor Saeed Abedini, as we all know, is currently serving an 8-year sentence in the brutal Rajeh Shah prison in Iran. 2002, on a visit to Tehran, Naghmeh met Saeed and began assisting him in his ministry to house churches in Tehran, and they were married in 2004. She has been apart from her husband for more than a year, and as he remains imprisoned. They have 2 young children, Rebecca and Jacob, and no one has done more on behalf of any imprisoned person that I have ever seen. I've been here 33 years, than this very devoted and very articulate wife of Saeed Abedini. We'll then hear from Mr. Jordan Sekelo, who is Pastor Abedini's attorney. He is the executive director of the American Center for Law and Justice. He is also hosts radio and television programs featuring elected officials. He oversees much of ACLJ's international work, engaging with government officials and international leaders on human rights issues around the world, including and especially religious freedom. They will then hear from Daniel Collingart, who is Executive Vice President at Freedom House, where he oversees contributions to policy debate on democracy and human rights issues and outreach. He previously supervised Freedom House's civil society and media programs worldwide and contributes frequently to policy and media discussions on Internet freedom. Prior to joining Freedom House, Dr. Collingart was Associate Director of American University's Center for Democracy and Election Management and Associate Director of the Commission on Federal Election Reform. He also served as Director for Asia and as Deputy Director for Eastern Europe and International Republican Institute. Dr. Sweat, if you could begin.
Thank you so much. It's always a great honor for me to appear before this committee and to have the chance to speak with some of the very distinguished colleagues of my late father. And of course, I'm always mindful when I'm here that I'm testifying under his watchful eye, and so I will try to be on good behavior. I also want to just say briefly what a privilege it is to testify with Mrs. Abedini. She is a towering example of love and devotion and courage, and I just want to say to you that you will prevail in your wonderful mission to free your husband. I remember another beautiful young wife, Avital Sharansky, from another generation who tirelessly worked walking the halls of Congress and meeting with the media to press for freedom for her husband, Natan Sharansky. And she was ultimately successful. You will be as well, and we are all standing with you and behind you and next to you. I want to thank Representatives Smith and Ross-Leighton and your subcommittees for holding this hearing and inviting USCIRF to testify. With your approval, I will submit my written testimony for the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. I commend your focus on the continued deterioration of religious freedom conditions in Iran, most notably for Christians and other religious minorities, and for highlighting the egregious treatment of Pastor Saeed Abedini. USCIRF stands with Mrs. Abedini and her family, has called repeatedly for the pastor's release, and urges the U.S. government at the highest levels to demand his release. Unfortunately, the appalling treatment of Pastor Abedini reflects the dismal reality of religious freedom and human rights in Iran today. The rights and beliefs defining the Iranian dictatorship's character remain self-consciously religious and inescapably theocratic. Any Iranian dissenting from the government's interpretation of Shia Islam may be considered the state's enemy and a potential target for abuse. Because religion matters significantly to Iran's government, we must look at how the government treats the right to religious freedom to assess the overall status or direction of human rights. That lens also is necessary to evaluate Iran's current president, Hassan Rouhani. The number of Christians and Baha'is jailed during his short tenure has increased, and a crackdown on Protestant Christians has brought numerous arrests. In June 2009, Iran reached a watershed moment when, after a national election, citizens protested the legitimacy of its outcome. Tehran responded with brutal repression. Since then, human rights and religious freedom conditions have worsened to levels unseen since the early years after the '79 revolution. The United States, since 1999, annually has designated Iran a country of particular concern, or CPC. Its government continues to rank among the world's worst religious freedom abusers, engaging in and tolerating systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations. Members of religious minorities, including Baha'i, Zoroastrians, Christians, Jews, Muslims belonging to minority Sufi and Sunni sects, and even Muslims part of Iran's Shia majority, have had their fundamental rights abused. Among Iran's religious minority communities, the Baha'is long have been subject to particularly severe religious freedom abuses. Besides its severe mistreatment of Baha'is, Iran's government discriminates against and represses Christians. While all of Iran's Christians face a regime that restricts their rights, Tehran reserves particularly harsh treatment for Protestant Christians. Next to Baha'is, authorities view the Protestant community as the most serious competitor of the theocratic government for Iranians' hearts and minds. Iranian Christians, including Protestants, constitute less than 1% of Iran's 75 million citizens, and it reflects the fundamental weakness and insecurity of the regime that they should consider them such a threat. Unlike Iran's ethnic Christian population, the vast majority of Iran's Protestants are converts from Islam. While conversion is a fundamental freedom that international law and covenants guarantee, Iran's government views conversion from Islam as an act against Islam and Iran's character as an Islamic state. In other words, as an act of apostasy, punishable by death. Revolutionary courts also charge converts with political crimes, such as acting against national security or contact with a foreign enemy. Hundreds of Christians, mostly Protestants, have been arbitrarily arrested and detained. The UN Special Rapporteur's October report found that since 2010, more than 300 Christians have been arrested and detained. As of July, at least 20 Christians were detained or imprisoned. In a particularly outrageous miscarriage of justice, Judge Pir Abbasi, notorious for perpetrating religious freedom violations, sentenced Saeed Abedini, an Iranian-born American pastor, on January 27, 2013, to 8 years in prison for, quote, threatening the national security of Iran. His crimes: participating in Iran's house church movement and raising money for an orphanage. Human rights groups view his trial, like those of other condemned, as unfair and the legal process deeply flawed. He spent many weeks in solitary confinement and suffered mental and physical abuse while in Evin prison. Last month, Pastor Abedini was transferred to the Gohardasht prison outside Tehran, which is known for its harsh and unsanitary conditions. Below are selected USCIRF recommendations. Others and more detailed ones can be found in our written testimony. First, the U.S. government should continue to designate Iran as a country of particular concern. Second, Congress should reauthorize for multiple years, and the President should sign into law the Lautenberg Amendment, which has provided a lifeline for Iranian religious minorities. Third, the U.S. at the highest level should call on the Iranian government to release all prisoners who have been jailed due to their religion or belief and drop all charges against those with pending cases, including, and I hope you will bear with me as I show the pictures of these individuals, because we must never forget these are real flesh and blood human beings who are being persecuted. So those we call upon to be released are Saeed Abedini, Farshad Fatih, Benham Irani, Vahid Haqqani, and there are too many others of these Christians, but some of them are noted in my written testimony. Among the Shia Muslims who are persecuted, Ayatollah Hossein Kazemeni Burujerdi, the Baha'i Seven, including Fariba Kamalabadi and Mavash, I'm sorry, I think I did two there, Mavash Sabet, the Baha'i educators Farhan Heshami and Riaz Sobani. and finally, the Sufi activist Hamid Reza Moradi. USCIRF encourages representatives, and this is really directed at each one of you, to join the Defending Freedoms Project, an initiative of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in conjunction with USCIRF and Amnesty International. Members adopt a prisoner of conscience and advocate on their behalf and shine a light on the conditions in the country and the government that imprisons them. The U.S. government should continue to identify Iranian government agencies and officials responsible for particularly severe violations of religious freedom, bar them from entry into the U.S., and freeze their assets. My written testimony notes 9 individuals, including the Supreme Leader Ayatollah al-Khamenei. Just last week, National Security Advisor Susan Rice reaffirmed the administration's commitment to continue to sanction Iran's human rights abusers. We welcome further action by the Treasury and State Departments, especially given that the European Union has far outpaced the United States in identifying and sanctioning these violators. Iran's religious freedom abuses demand the world's attention and action, especially given that the Iranian government may use efforts to resolve the nuclear issue to divert attention from the increasing mistreatment of Christians and other religious minorities. We cannot let that happen. If Pastor Abedini and religious minorities in Iran ever needed a voice to condemn Iran's abusive practices, it is now. The Obama administration and members of Congress should insist that Iran demonstrate its commitment to peaceful intentions abroad by ceasing its war at home against its own people and their fundamental rights, including the right of freedom of religion or belief. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Dr. Sweat, thank you very much for your testimony and for bringing additional focus on all of the other imprisoned individuals who are there because of their faith. Ms. Abedini, it's a high honor and privilege to welcome you to the 2 subcommittees.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittees. My name is Nagme Abedini. I have submitted my full statement for the record, and I would like to use this time to tell the story of our family and ask for your assistance.
Without objection, your and all the witnesses' full statements and any papers you'd like to attach to the record will be made a part of the record.
Thank you. When I spoke in front of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission in March of this year, I had anticipated that I would battle the Iranian government for my husband's freedom. I never anticipated that I would also have to battle my own government, and that the journey would become even much more difficult than it had been. My husband is suffering because he's a Christian. He's suffering because he's an American. Yet his own government did not fight for him when his captors were across the table from them. Said converted from Islam to Christianity in the year 2000 after having a radical encounter with Jesus. And in that encounter, Jesus Christ told Said that he was coming back soon and to go preach the gospel. And from there, his life was transformed. And if he would sit here to testify today, he would say he found true joy, love, and peace that he could not find in his former religion. So today, Said sits in that Iranian prison being tortured for his faith. He will not deny the faith that has saved him, that has given him life. He refuses to deny his faith in Jesus and return to Islam. When the Iranian government sentenced him to 8 years in prison in the January of this year, they went back to the year 2000 to 2005, the year of his conversion, and the year where the house churches were started, and he was working under a more moderate government. Khatami was the name of the president before President Ahmadinejad. And at that time, he was working under the supervision of a government-approved building church. The Iranian government was well aware of the house church movement and was allowing it. So for them to have arrested him in the year 2012, when he was working with the Iranian government on an orphanage, on a government-approved orphanage, and to say that his crime dated back to 13 years earlier when he was working under a different administration, under a different president, was unbelievable. And to say that he was undermining the national security of Iran by having started those house churches, Christian gatherings. And they actually, in the court hearing, they actually said he'd conducted soft war. It's unbelievable that they would consider peaceful gatherings of Christian an act of war. As many of you have mentioned today, Said has been tortured.
He's been beaten, abused, and told to deny his Christian faith, and that if he would return to Islam, he would be freed. He's been in that prison. The kids and I have not seen him since June of last year, but he's been sitting in Evan prison since September, and recently last month he was moved to Raja Ishar prison, where his condition have worsened, and the kids and I fear his life. I want to share a little bit of a personal story here. This is the first day of school. It was a very painful time. I'm trying to smile, but tears were streaming down my face as I got my two kids ready for school, knowing that their dad was missing. And as I took him to school, I could see their wandering eyes looking at their daddies, saying, holding their kids and putting them to school. And I was trying to distract them. But it was a painful time for them to know that their daddy was missing. And it was a painful time for me. And it's been hard. It's been a struggle as a mom watching as my 7-year-old and my 5-year-old cry themselves to sleep every single night for the last 444 days. And knowing that unless we get Saeed out quickly, he might serve the 8 years or even more, or he might not even survive that prison sentence. He wrote a recent letter to my daughter on her 7th birthday, and he'd seen a picture of her. And his parents, when they visit him in prison, they say that when they hold the pictures of the kids in front of him, he just cries. And he wrote in a letter, he said, "It is so hard and so heartbreaking for me to see these pictures and to know that I'm not there beside you as you grow. I'm here to help the kids. I came here to help the kids that did not have mommies and daddies, but my own kids lost their daddy. This breaks my heart so much. I want you to know that I did not want to put so much pressure on your little shoulders, my precious children." While I am grateful for the official declaration to national media and public acknowledgement from our government, it is not enough. We need to see action to back our rhetoric in the living, breathing form of Saeed Abedini, alive and well, having been immediately released to the reuniting embrace of our family. Not all Americans are Christians, but every American, regardless of their belief, needs to be reassured and know that our government will take decisive action to protect us if our fundamental rights are violated. An American president who has taken his oath of office with honorable intention and is attuned to the international issues will recognize Iran's treatment of Saeed for the assault that it is on our national security. For Iran's treatment of Saeed Abedini is not about one American citizen experiencing a living nightmare for his religious belief. Iran's treatment of Saeed Abedini is an experiment. Iran is curious. How strong is our American president? How serious is he about American security? Would he act immediately with firm resolve to protect and to defend? Time is of the essence. Iran's experiment for evaluating the integrity of Americans' response to assault on her security is almost complete. And Iran is not the only country watching our reaction. Even if our president can't see the reality, the rest of the world can. In the interest of Americans' confidence in the competency of her government official, her national security, and international standing, Saeed Abedini needs to be released now. I want to say that I can't express how grateful I am to the members of Congress who have refused to let my husband be forgotten. And I would like to end with, as we approach Christmas, which is a joyful time of the year, but it's a painful time for our family to celebrate another year without my husband. I want to end with this. Saeed's in that prison because he believes, "Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder. His name will be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." And this season, I not only pray for the release of my husband, but I hope and I pray that our government would realize where we've fallen from, and how far we've fallen, and that we would return to the source of blessing, May God bless America, the land that I love. Thank you. God bless you.
Ms. Abedini, thank you so very much for those powerful words. And that testimony is just, I think it causes every one of us to redouble our efforts and do everything possible to ensure that your husband is released immediately. So thank you so very much. Mr. Sekulow.
Chairman Smith and Chairman Ross Layton and the Ranking Member Deutsch, the other co-chairs and chairs of subcommittees that are here today, and members of the subcommittees, I'm deeply honored to present this report on behalf of Pastor Saeed and Naghmeh Abedini as their attorney, as an organization that represents them, and their two children, their American children, Rebecca and Jacob. My primary purpose for submitting this testimony is to impress upon Congress the desperate need for great urgency as Pastor Saeed is in a dire predicament. Congress has done more than any branch of government. Congress has been there, and it's been bipartisan. But first, let me begin by, again, thanking you and your staffs for having this hearing. You know, we started back in March at the Lantos Commission, and now here we are, months later, the United States, in an unprecedented move that we did not predict or could not predict then, is now sitting with Iran. And I think it's important for us to point out right now that we don't see this, or religious liberty at all, as a partisan issue. So I want to recognize that the unbelievable bipartisan efforts that have occurred within this Congress on behalf of Pastor Saeed Abedini. We don't forget that, and when we speak out on Saeed's behalf, and if we are critical of the administration, we always make sure to mention that there's been that bipartisan support. I'm hopeful that today's hearing will highlight the commitment to this case that so many of you have shown, and the world will hear the U.S. government speaking with one voice. That's so clear. One voice. In strong defense of our fellow citizen, Pastor Saeed Abedini. At such a critical juncture, with the U.S. government literally sitting across the table from Iran, we could never have imagined that that would occur when we first testified before the Lantos Commission in March. At the table, for the first time in 34 years, we need to ensure that Pastor Saeed and the other Americans mentioned here today, wrongfully detained, are seen as not a marginal issue, but an essential of those ongoing diplomatic talks. Pastor Saeed Abedini, a U.S. citizen, has been unnecessarily separated from his wife Naghmeh and two children for 17 months, 444 days. The Islamic Republic of Iran has arbitrarily detained and imprisoned Pastor Saeed, subjecting him to violence and abuse, violating both Iranian law and international norms. His trial lacked transparency and due process, and yet appeals courts in Tehran upheld his conviction and 8-year prison sentence. Pastor Saeed has exhausted all legal remedies in Iran to appeal this arbitrary conviction and his detention. His freedom now rests solely on the success of diplomatic efforts by the United States government and world leaders dedicated to human rights. Now, Naghmeh has outlined the timeline of Saeed's case, and a more detailed outline is in my submitted remarks. Allow me to briefly highlight just a couple of more egregious facts about the legal proceedings. First, Saeed was detained arbitrarily and while conducting humanitarian work with the full approval of the Iranian government. Next, Saeed was imprisoned, subjected to solitary confinement without even being informed about the charges against him. Third, Saeed was informed of the official charges against him less than a week before his sham trial and denied access to his attorney until less than 24 hours before that trial. Finally, Saeed and his attorney were barred from attending the second half of the trial, the half in which, quote, key witness testimony was taken, thereby denying his legal team the ability to question or even know who those witnesses were. Predictably, this resulted in Saeed's conviction and 8-year prison sentence on January 27, 2013. Judge Pir Abbasi, who presided over Pastor Saeed's trial, has earned the nickname the Hanging Judge. Despite the fact that Judge Pir Abbasi has been individually sanctioned by the European Union and that the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom under the chair of Ms. Sweat and also now as vice chair, has repeatedly made a similar recommendation to the United States Department of State. To date, the U.S. has failed to place any sanctions on Judge Pir Abbasi. The EU has acted. The United States has not. You heard from Naghmeh about the horrific prison conditions that Saeed is enduring, that he's being denied basic medical care, and that he's been transferred to a much more difficult prison than Evin Prison. See, this is Raja Shah Prison, built for 5,000 violent criminals, real criminals, murderers, rapists, drug dealers, people convicted and sentenced to death or life in prison. Built for 5,000 inmates, it is currently housing approximately 22,000. It's a prison out of control with violence. To define the situation as inhumane would be a gross understatement. In addition to the horrific abuse and torture Pastor Saeed has faced at the hands of his own brutal Iranian captors, Pastor Saeed has not always had the full backing of his own government. And I want to be clear here, I mean the executive branch. Members of Congress have been with us on both sides, Republican and Democrat, since the beginning. When the Iranian government initially detained Pastor Saeed, the U.S. State Department excused its lack of assistance on the fact that the U.S. lacked any diplomatic ties with Iran. That doesn't work anymore. So now, when the U.S. has historically communicated with, sits across from the table, the Iranian government, the U.S. government has still failed to secure the release of Pastor Saeed and the other Americans in prison. As Naghmeh pointed out, this Congress has spoken with strength and unity on behalf of Pastor Saeed, and we are grateful that President Obama expressed his concern about the Americans imprisoned in Iran on his historic phone call with Iranian President Hassan Rouhani back in September. But as you all know, as members of Congress, as principals, if there's no follow-up to your discussion, little gets done. Everyone has a lot to do. And you have staffs, you have your staff that you rely on to make sure what you've agreed to on phone calls or said you will do is done. Yet, 2 days ago, Secretary of State Kerry sat at this table, and to you, Chairman Smith, he said that this matter is a priority for him. But numerous statements from his department claim that Saeed was either not brought up or only discussed on the margins. For us, you can understand the incompetence. Was he brought up? Was he on the margins? If you look at Secretary Kerry's statements to you, Chairman Smith, it's very difficult to tell. He made a pretty broad statement of no. But you've had others, including those who are even going before their hearings in the Senate for confirmation yesterday, told Senator Rubio that he was brought up on the margins of the P5+1. So who's telling the truth? We were told he was by the State Department, but then when Secretary Kerry testified, and then there's other statements we can point to as well, the Deputy National Security Advisor, Tony Blinken, said on CNN to Wolf Blitzer, no, it was not. It is not part of the agenda. But yet the National Security Council spokesperson, Ben Rhodes, later that day on CNN said it was on the margins. On the margins is bad enough. Not at all is even worse. We don't know which one of those to believe. And that's why we believe, Mr. Chairman, that offer from Secretary Kerry to hold that classified briefing for members of Congress should be absolutely acted upon. And we would welcome the opportunity to provide you with the kind of questions and information that we've received from the State Department so that you can get the answers and we can hear back from you at least to know whether you're satisfied with what we believe is our government's incompetence. Let me just begin by expressing my gratitude to both subcommittees for taking an active role in Pastor Saeed's case. And just to highlight again that while our government sat across the table from the Iranian delegation, Saeed was transferred to a worse prison. Was it on the margins or was it not on the agenda? That's an answer we need from the United States executive branch and from the Obama administration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sekulow, and we will indeed follow up with that classified briefing. But also, I know everyone else who is concerned about Pastor Abedini will be raising this issue repeatedly going forward at every venue where we have an interface with the administration, because there was a sense of conflicting information even as the Secretary of State spoke. So thank you for your testimony and for being an excellent lawyer on behalf of Mr. Abedini. Mr. Cullingard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairwoman, honorable members. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. I want to thank you for your leadership in championing the case of Pastor Abedini and pressing for his release. Sadly, the kinds of abuses that he suffers are all too common in Iran. During the campaign for the presidency of Iran, Hassan Rouhani repeatedly promised to release all political prisoners and to make a change in favor of free speech and media freedom. The record of his first 4 months in office shows otherwise. He has yet to live up to these promises. 15 prominent political prisoners were released in September, but approximately 800 dissidents, including human rights defenders, journalists, and political activists, remain unjustly detained in Iran. The leaders of the Green Movement, Mir Hussein Mousavi, Mehdi Karoubi, Zahra Ranavad, are still under house arrest. While some limited space has opened up for women's rights activists, the overall situation for human rights in Iran is as grim under President Rouhani as it was before. In the past few weeks, Iran's Interior Ministry and Revolutionary Guards have carried out a new wave of arrests to stifle free expression. At least 38 people were arrested, including editors and staff of a technology website, Naranji, and activists in the province of Kerman who were accused of receiving foreign assistance to produce online content that undermines the Islamic regime. These arrests come on the heels of a December 3rd court ruling that exonerated government officials accused of murdering Sattar Beheshti, a blogger who was detained by the Iranian cyber police and was later found dead in his jail cell with bruises on his body. Iran is second only to China in the number of executions it carries out. This year, 668 reported executions have already taken place. Virtually all capital cases lack internationally recognized standards of due process, and death sentences are often imposed for relatively minor crimes, such as drug possession. The Iranian regime, dominated by Shiite clerics and Revolutionary Guard commanders, is highly repressive. It systematically tramples political and civil rights. In Freedom House's annual report on freedom in the world, Iran receives a rating of 6 on a scale of 1 to 7, where 7 is the lowest score. The election of Rouhani was welcomed by some in Iran and abroad because he was the least conservative of the candidates, but his election was anything but fair. Over 600 candidates had registered to run in that election, but only 6 names appeared on the ballot. And who made that decision? The Guardian Council, 12 Islamic clerics and jurists, not the voters. The media environment in Iran is among the most restrictive in the world. Iran ranks 191st out of 197 countries in Freedom House's annual ratings on media freedom. The government directly controls all television and radio broadcasting, and print media, blogs, and news websites are severely censored. Restrictions on online space are equally, if not more, severe. In the latest edition of Freedom House's rankings on internet freedom, which covered 60 countries, Iran came in very last place. With all that is at stake in the negotiations with Iran on its nuclear program, there is a temptation to put aside human rights issues because they might complicate the negotiations. But that would be a mistake. Speaking out for human rights in Iran, as elsewhere, both reflects U.S. values and serves U.S. interests, and it can be done at the same time as we negotiate on nuclear matters. The Iranian people's aspirations for greater freedom are abundantly clear. They were expressed in the votes for Rouhani and his promises for change, and they were seen in a recent Zogby poll that showed issues of political reform trumped other concerns. The Iranian regime stifles free expression because the citizens are expressing a desire for political change. They want to modernize their country, to exchange opinions freely, and to become open to the rest of the world. An Iranian government that is more attuned to the views of its own citizens will be less hostile toward the United States and more constructive in its foreign relations. When faced with international criticism of its human rights abuses, the Iranian government invariably is defiant, but it does listen. International pressure has, for example, led to the release of former political prisoners such as Maziar Bahari, Roxana Saberi, and, most recently in September, Nasrin Sotoudeh. One thing is certain: the Iranian government's record on human rights does not improve when the United States stays silent. The United States can put human rights high on the agenda with its adversaries at the same time as it addresses other sensitive and complex issues. The Reagan administration kept human rights on the agenda while negotiating nuclear arms treaties with the Soviet Union. President Clinton spoke out about the struggle for individual freedom at Beijing University during a state visit in 1998 and still held constructive talks with Chinese government leaders on a range of security and economic issues. Iranians who want to change their country for the better understand that the struggle for freedom is their struggle. They have to stand up for their rights and demand that their government listen to them. But Iranians notice what we in the United States say and don't say. When we stay silent, we send the message that we don't care about their struggle for freedom. And that message is disheartening for Iranians today, and it will hurt our credibility with them for a long time to come. The United States needs to put human rights on its agenda with the government of Iran. Thank you.
Mr. Collingrott, thank you very much for your testimony and for your historical perspective as well. As you were speaking, it called to mind, and Dr. Lato Sweat made this point about Natan Sharansky and his wife, who worked tirelessly for his release. Congressman Wolf, Chairman Wolf, and I were actually in Perm Camp 35, the infamous prison where Sharansky had been incarcerated, just a few months after he was released. Obviously, many other political prisoners were still there. But the lessons learned from the way we handled human rights with the Soviet Union was that you integrate them, you never stovepipe them. We risked superpower confrontation with a country that was bristling with nuclear weapons aimed at the United States because we put human rights and the value of human life at such a high level that, I mean, when Secretary Shultz would visit Moscow, my first trip to the Soviet Union was in '82 on behalf of Soviet Jewish refuseniks. He would always meet with all the dissidents and then meet with the Soviets as well. There was never this stovepiping, this separation, this doing something in another room. And I think your reminder of that, Mr. Collingrott, couldn't come at a more, and you did it as well, Mr. Sekulow. You all did, frankly, because I am very concerned, especially in response to the question I asked of the Secretary just 2 days ago, and then the different versions that we've gotten from other people within the administration. Was it discussed or not? And it would look, or it would seem, if it was discussed at all, it was on the margins, and it should have been center stage. Every conversation that we had with the Iranians should have begun with Saeed Abedini and ended with Saeed Abedini. How can we trust the Iranians' signature on a piece of paper if they so callously mistreat not only their own human rights defenders, but if they take pastors like Saeed Abedini, an American, and not only incarcerate him, but as you pointed out, Mr. Sekulow, at the very time when these negotiations are happening, transfer him from one terrible prison to an infamous prison where he is even at greater risk. That was a message sender that seemed to have been missed by the U.S. Department of State and by the administration. And I would agree with all of you who made it very clear there's no partisanship here. I can tell you, having been here 33 years, when we unite on human rights in Congress, no matter who's in the White House, it's all about standing up for the victims and others, their families, like Mrs. Abedini, and making sure that we speak out very loudly and very clearly. But we are not in those negotiations face-to-face with, in this case, the Iranians. So, again, I think your message here today that this has to be integrated, mainstreamed, and not stovepiped is very clear, because I too, like others on this panel, think about and pray about Pastor Abedini every single day. Thank you for reminding us just how important this is. So the integration issue is very important. If I could ask very quickly, Dr. Lantos Sweat, you've asked as a commission that under Section 105 of the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions and Disinvestment Act, that certain Iranian officials be censored because of their mistreatment based on religious persecution. And if I could also just, when you said, Mr. Sekulow, that Pastor Saeed has exhausted all legal remedies, who now makes the decision? It really does come down to a negotiation with the United States, doesn't it? They'd have to know that the value is sufficiently high that the relationship with Iran hinges. The tipping point is how well or how poorly going forward they will treat Pastor Abedini. And finally, your statement, Mrs. Abedini, was very bold when you called on the President to re-engage, when you called on the Secretary of State to re-engage, and when you said, please don't let this case be discussed on the margins, and please make his case a priority. There will be more negotiations, and I think the sooner that re-engagement occurs, the better, if you would want to elaborate on that as well. Dr. Sweat.
Well, we think that the application of sanctions directed at specific people implicated in human rights and religious freedom abuses is incredibly important. It's part of the long tradition, successful tradition of the human rights movement in general to name and shame and blame, to identify, to pin responsibility on those responsible. And so it really is critically important. And the fact is, there's been a lot of discussion about President Rouhani's charm offensive. But when we look at what is actually going on in Iran under his leadership, it's actually more offensive than it is charming, particularly, again, as it relates to religious freedom violations. And so we feel very, very strongly that step of our government officially saying, you are not welcome here. If you have assets here, they will be frozen. They will be, put beyond your reach. Those sorts of concrete steps send that message that you're not a political leader, engaging in respectful and appropriate sort of leadership in your country. You are someone who is personally implicated in vile abuses of the human rights of your citizens. We know it. We're saying it. And by doing so, the rest of the world knows it as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In my statement, when I discussed that Saeed cannot be left in the margins, I believe that if we do not speak out, if we do not put him at the center stage, then we're not only sending the world a wrong message about where we stand in terms of human rights issues. We're sending Iran, but especially with the Middle East, with the high increase of persecution on the Christians and religious minorities. I believe by putting Saeed as just not a person, it's where we stand and where we put our value in terms of human rights issues. And I think it's very dangerous. Americans are watching our government to see what we will do, and the world's watching to see where we stand in terms of important human rights issues such as religious freedom, which has been a important value since this country was founded. So I believe that leaving it at the margins is very dangerous and is sending a very dangerous message to the world.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I would assert again, as my opening statement, the ineptness of the State Department's relationship with Mrs. Abedini. She is represented not just by us, but ultimately by the U.S. government, who is sitting at that table. And I will tell you that in conversations with them, that they ask us to keep confidential, and they ask us to, what updates they're doing around the world. And for instance, I will point out something that was news to us. I don't know if Secretary Kerry misspoke when he mentioned the Swedish, but they had never been mentioned to us on any phone calls. And there are countries that have. That is not one of them. He may have misspoke, but that would be something to clear up. We have also been told on those phone calls. Now, this is by lower-level staff, mostly in NEA, so the Near East Affairs Department of the State, that it was absolutely being brought up on the margins. So why would Secretary Kerry have been so broad in that statement that it was not? And then third and finally, the idea that bringing them up would make them hostages or pawns, I would beg to differ and state that Mr. Abedini, as well as Mr. Hekmati and Mr. Levinson, already are pawns, and they already are hostages of Iran. They are American citizens being held by a foreign government. We're sitting at the table with them. Some have been hostages for nearly 7 years, 2 years, or 444 days. They're already at that point. Thank you.
I would just conclude before yielding to Mr. Deutsch that 2 days ago, on December 10th, we, along with Congresswoman, Chairwoman Ileana Ross-Layton, chaired a hearing on Coptic Christians. For me, it was my 4th hearing in 2 years on Coptic Christians. And many of us fought very hard to get language into the Foreign Office Appropriations Bill that conditioned United States aid. It's properly conditioned on the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement, the Camp David. But we said religious freedom also, there ought to be conditionality there as well. We got into the Foreign Ops bill. Mrs. Clinton waived it. As the Coptic Christians were being slaughtered, churches decimated, monasteries, many of them hundreds of years old, we looked askance and embraced Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood. It was appalling. And one of the issues that I raised repeatedly, again, I think what Mrs. Abedini is doing, one of the side issues that will help all others is pointing out a huge deficiency. Many Coptic Christian girls had been abducted, forced into Islamic marriages. We had a woman who actually did the reporting on it. She's a noted human rights investigator, bring this information forward, and the administration did nothing on it. And that is very disturbing. So there's a larger backdrop issue of a disregard for religious freedom issues that has to change, and it has to start with Pastor Abedini. Mr. Deutsch.
I thank the chairman. I have, let me start. I have a couple questions for Dr. Lantos-Sweat and Dr. Collinger. Let me start, though, just by telling Ms. Abedini that there is a real commitment by Congress to bring your husband home, and there is a real commitment by the entire government, including the administration, to bring your government home. And I didn't come here to, I didn't come to this hearing this morning to apologize or come to the defense of the administration. But I would respectfully suggest that as we address these human rights issues, the best way for us to address them, starting with your husband and his release, is to work in a unified fashion to do it. And I don't believe, Mr. Sekulow, that it's helpful for us in this hearing for the hearing to turn on allegations of incompetence and ineptitude by the administration. I just wanted to make that point. I will look forward to the classified briefing that we're going to have with Secretary Kerry and others. Pastor Abedini, I can only speak to the briefings that I've had with respect to with my constituent, and I know discussions that we've had on a broader level about human rights. I would just respectfully suggest that there is a real commitment to bringing home. I am sympathetic. I understand your frustration. I don't blame you 1 minute for the immense difficulty and the sadness that you feel every day that your husband's not with you and your family. That commitment, as we've all expressed here, is very real. Let me just ask Dr. Sweat and Dr. Collinger a question about not just what happens here in the United States and in this Congress and the administration, but more broadly internationally. First, the Lautenberg Amendment here saved the lives of many religious minorities in Iran. But multilaterally, in every year since 2002, we've worked with the Canadians on a UN resolution condemning Iran's human rights record. In 2011, we successfully led an effort to create a special rapporteur on human rights in Iran. But regardless of what happens, and this is the frustration a lot of us feel, regardless of what happens on the nuclear profile, it appears that the human rights situation doesn't change. And my question is, even as we're working tirelessly, focused on individual cases, starting with Pastor Abedini, how do we expand this? What's the next big step that we can take, either domestically or through the United Nations, to raise awareness of human rights? Dr. Kallengar, you talked about making human rights matter in Iran for the United States. What's the next big step we can take for the United States to lead and for this Congress to lead to make human rights really matter internationally? Dr. Sweat, please.
Well, it's a critical question, one that I think those involved in the human rights movement grapple with on an ongoing basis. But I do think a central part of the answer to that question is that human rights, religious freedom, have to be elevated in the public discourse. At the end of the day, we have limited ability to force other governments to do things that we want them to do. But we do have the power still, as the world's indispensable nation, to raise the profile of their wrongdoing, to make it extraordinarily uncomfortable and unpleasant and unwelcoming for them in the community of civilized nations. And we have to do that, And I do think the whole situation with the efforts to reach agreement on Iran's nuclear program is an extraordinary window of opportunity, and shame on us if we miss it. I think a lot of people have observed that it was sanctions, crippling, painful, biting sanctions, that ultimately brought Iran to the table. Undoubtedly, it was the unspoken threat of military action, whether on the part of Israel or other players that have also brought them to the table. So it's vulnerability to some degree on Iran's part that has broken ground in that arena. That vulnerability needs to be exploited not merely to achieve progress on the nuclear front, but to achieve progress on the human rights front. That vulnerability speaks to the internal situation in Iran specifically. We know that the Iranian people are chafing under the regime that they are living under. And so I very, very strongly believe that we should not let this moment of opportunity slip by. It's as if you had somebody in your neighborhood, as it were, who was a notorious drug dealer, as well as a notorious abuser of their children and their spouse. Well, the drug dealing sort of involves spreading a poison and a danger out into the broader community. That would sort of be the nuclear side of what worries us about Iran. The abuse within their home would relate to the human rights issues that are of concern to us. I don't think any of us would be content to say, well, for the moment they've stopped dealing drugs, so we're good, we're done, mission accomplished. We would insist that we pursue, in whatever avenues were appropriate, stopping that abuse within the house. And I think that needs to be the approach that we take as a government.
Right. Dr. Kallengar, do you have thoughts on how to elevate the issue?
Yes, Mr. Deutsch. I think I very much agree that it's important to address these issues multilaterally. And I like your starting point, the UN Special Rapporteur, his efforts and the resolutions that Canada and the U.S. have pushed are very significant because, first of all, they put all countries on record where they stand in regard to Iran's human rights abuses. And in that process, they show that the concern about Iran's human rights record extends far beyond the United States and Western Europe, that there are countries around the world that think that the Iran's record is shameful. I think there are many steps that can be taken by the U.S. in cooperation with other democratic governments. There's I don't think any sort of big breakthrough to be had, but I think it's important to push this issue in all these ways in a consistent basis. So even starting with the UN Special Rapporteur, he has been trying to simply get access to the country, to be able to have an official visit. I think it's important to keep pushing for that. His mandate will come up, and it's important to renew that mandate so that he can continue his important work. The collaboration with the European Union is important, from the examples of sanctions that Dr. Lanta-Sweat mentioned, and also bringing attention to individual cases. One of the political prisoners that was released in September, Nasrin Sotoudeh, was a recipient of the European Parliament Sakharov Prize. I don't think that's a coincidence. The fact that there was major attention given to her case put pressure on the Iranian government to release her. And that's why I think it's important to push on individual cases. It seems like a tough slog. Obviously, even the releases are pretty few when you consider there's still 800 dissidents in detention, and many of them aren't known. But for even the few that are released, it sends an important signal to those who are still struggling for human rights on the ground that there is hope, and especially that the outside world cares about their efforts.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If I could, Mr. Chairman, respond to one of Congressman Deutsch's statements. The incompetence has not been at the level of Republicans and Democrats in Congress. It's been at a bureaucratic level. And it's clear because on television, members of the administration at the White House, the National Security Council says one thing happens in the negotiation. The Deputy National Security Advisor says something else happens. Secretary Kerry then says something else. And I would add, for the Congressman, with all due respect, I know he represents, as a constituent, Robert Levinson. 7 years missing. I don't want to be here 6 years from now. I'd say that's incompetent, especially when we have an opportunity.
You know what, Mr. Sekulow, excuse me. First of all, we're here today to focus on human rights in a country that has absolutely no respect for them, and we're focusing on human rights in a country that has immense respect for them. And to bring discredit on the men and women who have spent the past 7 years trying to bring Bob Levinson home, to advance some agenda, unknown agenda that I can't fathom, when we're all trying to work together to focus on human rights and to bring Pastor Abedini home, it's not right.
Congressman, things have significantly changed. And as you're walking out, in the last month, we are now in negotiations with Iran. That didn't happen 6 years ago. So whatever efforts you're talking about before, it was different. But in the last 6 weeks, we have a new relationship with Iran. We can't think about Iran as, and we still hear this from the State Department, we have no diplomatic ties. Well, depending on how you define that, when you're sitting down at the table regularly, I think that the whole situation is fundamentally changed. So to accept what was previously done as satisfactory is no longer satisfactory. That's what I'm saying.
Mr. Sekulow, since my time has expired and you've claimed some of the time that I no longer had, I would simply tell you that the commitment that exists to bring Pastor Abedini home and Mr. Hekmati home and to bring home my constituent is real. And have things changed? Absolutely they have. And does every one of us here believe that this is an issue that should be raised at every single meeting? Yes. I've said it, we've all said it, and we all need to ensure that it happens.
But so far we know it hasn't happened.
Well, gentlemen, yield. The reason why I wanted to chair and put together this hearing, along with my distinguished colleague from Florida, Ms. Ross-Layton, was precisely because of our concern that it was not being raised, it had not been integrated in a place where it could have made all the difference in the world. And just by way of historical fact, it was Mrs. Abedini at Frank Wolf's hearing who was told there is nothing we can do by the State Department. I've worked human rights issues for 33 years. There is absolutely everything they can do. And I would say parenthetically that on Jacob Ostreicher, and I know you've helped us on that, as has Congresswoman Ross-Layton, Jacob Ostreicher is an American being held now under house arrest, but 18 months in Palomasaro prison in Bolivia. Never charged with anything. His rights farm was fleeced from him, taken away. The prosecutors, the rogue prosecutors, many of whom are now in prison themselves, he is still under house arrest. I have tried repeatedly and asked Secretary Kerry himself to intervene, has not happened yet. We can't get above the level of Assistant Secretary to raise the issue, and that man, Jacob Ostreicher, a Jewish man, and there's anti-Semitism involved here, I had 4 hearings to bring the attention of the administration that dropped the ball like a ton of bricks on human rights with an American just like this American pastor, and for the first year they did nothing. And matter of fact, they were admonished by the administration to gag themselves and say nothing. Absolutely the wrong way to go about it. He at least got some out of prison, and he's under house arrest, so he's not facing the daily threats that he faced in Palomacero. So I see parallels that the State Department goes the path of least resistance. Human rights is sidetracked. When we did the International Religious Freedom Act back in 1998, and this is, I don't care who's in the White House, this has been a problem. Religious freedom was always given the back seat. And we put into the legislation not only the establishment of Mrs. Lantos's Sweat Commission to hold the administration to account with independent verification of what's going on, great reports that they do, particularly a recommendation for CPC countries, but the training of Foreign Service officers who are often clueless, and they're good people, but clueless about the nuances that often occurs in countries relative to religious freedom and the lack of it and the persecution of believers. So there has been a backdrop of dropping the ball. I asked Secretary of State John Kerry, was it a mainstream issue? And he said it was not part of the negotiation. That's a serious miss. And so I agree. We're working together on this.
Right.
But we're hoping the administration will take the cue from the wife, Mrs. Abedini, and from those who are concerned, including both sides of the aisle, to step up, to do more. And especially when you're sitting right across from the Iranian interlocutors who can make the difference. They could say, free Abedini today, and he's on a plane back to his wife and children.
Right. Mr. Chairman, I agree wholeheartedly with you that on every occasion we should do as much as we can to bring home Pastor Abedini and to bring home Mr. Hekmati and Jacob and my constituent, and that we should do everything we can to make this issue paramount. I agree with you. I simply point out that our goal, in addition to bringing home those who have been persecuted and held hostage, that our goal as well, more broadly, is to elevate human rights. In this debate here, to elevate human rights in this Congress, to make sure that this and every administration of either party puts human rights squarely not only on the table, but right up front. That's what we're all striving for. I'm simply making the point that as we strive to elevate human rights, I just hate to see our efforts to do that amount to a round attack on the administration. And I don't disagree. I think the administration, let me just finish. I think the administration needs to be, as I said, the administration needs to be pushed to make sure that human rights matters every single day. That's our job, and we do it well. And we need to continue to do it. And, Mr. Chairman, you've been a leader on these issues as long as you've been in this House, and I'm grateful for it. But I respectfully suggest that it becomes more difficult for us to make human rights the fundamental focus that it needs to be internationally if it appears that somehow this has turned into some sort of round of political squabble. Well, and that's the only point I'm trying to make.
Well, just one very brief point, and then I think Mr. Abedini wants to say something, then we'll go to the chair lady. When there's a deficiency, I believe we have a duty to speak out. Had Mrs. Abedini not said at Frank Wolf's hearing that she was told that there was nothing they can do, Chairman Wolf got on the phone, talked to Secretary Kerry, I think he talked to him personally, and all of a, and a statement went out immediately. We applauded the Secretary of State, all of us, and thanked him profusely for doing that. Now, several months later, sitting right across from the Iranians again, and the issue is not raised. And the wife of Pastor Abedini, I think wisely says, what is going on here? It needs to be integrated. It needs to be part of that discussion, and then he will be released. Otherwise, they take their cue by our lack of prioritization. The Iranian issue is over here on nuclear, but the issue of human rights is somewhere we're not sure where. So that was the reason for the hearing. Chairwoman Ross-Layton.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Mrs. Abedini, our prayers to you and to your children, and may our Lord continue to give you, your husband, and your children the strength you need to carry on with this important case. That is not a case. It's your husband. It's their children's father. But hearings like these, like this one, they are important because that's the way that we can push the administration, whatever the administration is in power, to do all that it can, to do more to ensure that your husband's release is immediate. And you may feel that certain individuals in power have abandoned your husband, and we can have disagreements about that, but the members here are united in a bipartisan manner to make sure that we will not remain silent, and we will continue to push. We're going to continue to raise your husband's case so that we can pressure all who can have a say in this to make Pastor Saeed's release a higher priority. Dr. Lantos Sweat, U.S. SURF has made recommendations to the U.S. government regarding religious freedom in Iran, several of which you outlined at a hearing on the same issue in March. What is your assessment of the administration's response to these recommendations? Do you believe that the U.S. has focused so much on attention on the nuclear negotiations that it has ignored the abysmal human rights record of Iran out of fear of angering the regime? Also, in October 2010, the Ayatollah Khamenei publicly called non-Muslims, religious minorities, enemies of Islam, and accused them of weakening the faith of Iran's Muslim youth. And another leading Ayatollah referred to non-Muslims as sinful animals. Statements like these they incite violence against religious minorities. Would you agree with that? Have you observed increased violence against these groups following these kinds of provocative statements by so-called leaders? And despite the recommendations of U.S. SURF and the European Union's decision to individually sanction the judge who gave Pastor Saeed this outrageous 8-year sentence, the U.S. has yet to sanction this judge. And it's not a partisan attack, it's a reality. What message does this lack of action send to religious minorities and human rights advocates in Iran? The Iranian regime's human rights record doesn't improve when the U.S. remains silent. It's an issue that doesn't get much attention because of the nuclear topic, but whatever the administration is in power, do you believe that the administration has been silent about Pastor Saeed's case? Do you believe it's spoken enough about this case and the case of others? And I've asked a lot of questions, and you can just pick whichever one you would like to answer. Otherwise, we'd be here forever. So we will start with Dr. Lantos Sweat.
Well, I think it would be an overstatement to say that they have ignored the human rights situation in Iran. And one of the things that I referenced in my testimony was a relatively recent statement by the National Security Advisor, Dr. Susan Rice. That's a very high-level person within the administration. And she said, and I quote, "Our sanctions on Iran's human rights abusers will continue, and so will our support for the fundamental rights of all Iranians." So ignore, I think, would be too strong of a term. But I would also be remiss if I were not to say that we certainly at USERF feel that more needs to be done and more can be done.
Thank you. I'm going to cut you off just so that we can hear from the others.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mrs. Abedini or Mr. Sickle, whoever would like.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would say, and because I do want to clear up again, and Congressman Deutsch is no longer with us, but my opening statement was all about this bipartisan support we've had in Congress, which has been unprecedented, and it's not a attack on a Republican and Democrat issue. It's an administration issue that I think Congress has also got to deal with. Are you being told what is accurate? And I hope that briefing, that classified briefing, clears what has been so difficult for the administration to communicate to us, which is what is actually being done and what's not, and when is it being done, and I would add to that, we've been told a number of times, well, Iran has been told, or this Iranian official, that Iranian official, from the president on down. What answer have we gotten? We've never been told an answer by Iran. And so, this idea that we may be asking sometimes on the margins, in a phone call, that's wonderful. What is the response?
He must not become an asterisk or a footnote.
Exactly right. Exactly.
Thank you. Yes, Mrs. Abedini.
I wanted to make sure Mr. Deutsch was here to discuss that, but I don't have an agenda, and there's nothing more than I would like to see my country united on an important issue such as human rights. I've been fighting tirelessly for my husband's release for over a year. It's been a lonely road for me and the kids as well. I haven't seen my kids most of this 444 days as well, and they haven't had a mom in the last year. But for me, as an American citizen, it was unbelievable. I felt abandoned when we had the chance to not necessarily to discuss it at the nuclear, but as a precondition, as a good faith effort, which we've done for the Iranian government, with the easing of the sanctions and the monetary and prisoners and so on. I would have expected my government, as we've done good faith efforts for Iran, to have I like that example of a drug dealer, and he's abusing his wife and kids. But what about he's abusing your child? You don't demand him to release your child before negotiating about the drug dealing? And I expected my government, before shaking hands with the world's #1 violator of human rights issues and supporter of terrorism, that's put aside. They have an American citizen.
Don't get me started about shaking hands.
Before shaking hands, before negotiating, we've done good faith effort. I expected our government to have Iran show good faith effort, that they want to work with us. This would have been a perfect opportunity for Iran to release the 3 Americans. And I don't have an agenda. I'm not a political person. I'm a mom, I'm a wife, and as an American citizen, and millions of American citizens who are behind me in this, we do not understand what happened. We do not understand, and I'm very much upset by it, and I very much feel abandoned, and I feel my husband has been abandoned. And I do hope he survives that prison and we can bring him home quickly.
Thank you. And the last word to the good doctor.
Every authoritarian government will push back when we bring up human rights. They'll fuss, they'll make excuses, they'll say it complicates everything else we want to do. That's their instinctive reaction. We should know better. The one thing that is clear, if we don't bring something up, they get the message. They get the message that we don't care. And I would also, again, point back to specific cases like Mazyar Bahari in 2009. By his own account, he felt sort of lost in prison, and once then Secretary of Clinton raised his case publicly, his treatment in prison immediately improved, and that led to his release. So it is critical that we raise these cases.
Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you, Mr. Smith. I'm sorry I'm going to have to depart. Thank you.
Mr. Meadows.
Thank you so much for being here for your testimony. I want to ask just a few clarifying questions. Ms. Abedini, if your husband were to be released today, he does not have an intention to go back to Iran and work against the government. Is that correct?
He does not.
Okay.
And
I knew the answer to that because you had shared that, but I think it's important to the American people that they realize that this was a pastor working on behalf of an orphanage of those who really ministering to the Iranian people, and that he was convicted and held for a trespass that happened many years prior to that. It was not like he was there violating a law at that particular time. It's, to put it in very mild terms, it's like me speeding 12 years ago and then somebody coming in and changing the speeding law and saying that you actually were going above the speed limit. Now we're going to convict you and throw you in jail. And so that's the injustice of it. The other part, I guess, that I would ask is, I know that you've been working with a number of officials in the State Department, in Congress, and throughout. You've expressed appreciation to me personally for many of them working, and so I don't want it to get lost today. You do have an appreciation for those that are continuing to work on your behalf, whether it's behind the scenes or out front. Is that correct?
Yes, very much.
Okay.
Very much so.
All right. Dr. Sweat, I want to come back to you. We've had a number of hearings where you've been here and you've raised this issue. And there's been a number of times I've said, who are the Bonhoeffers? Who are the Wilbur forces of today? And I think that you continue to champion those causes. And I just want to say thank you. By raising the issue that we've talked about and raising the issue here today, what more can we do in a bipartisan congressional way to raise the issue not only of Pastor Saeed Abedini, but of the other families, the pictures of whom you showed us? How can we come alongside the executive branch, the State Department, and encourage them to keep it at the forefront so it's not a picture that happens on one hearing on one day and then doesn't get raised again? How can we best help you in that in a bipartisan manner?
Well, I'll bring up again the Defending Freedoms Project, which is a specific concrete initiative of Amnesty International, USERF, and the Lantos Human Rights Commission, which I think would be a wonderful means of engaging more members of Congress in sort of embracing this work themselves directly. But I would like to say something about the role of the Congress in general, and I'm very sorry that my good friend Congressman Deutsch isn't still here, because I think Congress has an extraordinary role, has had an extraordinary role historically in being the conscience of our nation when it comes to human rights. It's simply a fact. I actually wrote my PhD dissertation on this subject, so it's something very near and dear to my heart. But if you look at the history of human rights being legislatively enshrined as a principal goal of U.S. foreign policy, it was the work of Congress that brought that about, in opposition to many administrations, one after the other, because every administration, every State Department, this isn't a criticism, this is the reality. They are balancing many, many different items on a big plate, and sometimes there is a tendency to put human rights in that small box in a corner of the room where it can occasionally get a tip of the hat, but it is not centrally enshrined. And Congress really has historically played that role, going back to the 1970s, of saying, no, this isn't optional, this is essential. This is going to be part of our official policy, that the promotion of human rights should be a central and principal goal of American foreign policy. And it's so important because that, above all, plays to our strengths. It is when we advocate for our deepest values that we are playing to our strengths and playing from our strength. And so I would say that Congress has an indispensable role. Administrations will always resist and will always push back because there will always be other things on the agenda, whether it's our economic interests or nuclear concerns.
So should we tie that human rights to have an economic element to it? I mean, because so many times we negotiate on economics and we negotiate on human rights and they don't come together. Should we tie those together?
Well, I'm a big believer in the school of linkage and not decoupling of human rights from our other essential foreign policy goals. They're all important, but I think that when we link human rights to our other foreign policy goals, we strengthen our position. And I would say, just in general, and I don't have a specific proposal to put in front of you, although, we obviously talked about the Lautenberg Amendment and the need to reauthorize that on a multi-year basis. But that's an example of Congress acting legislatively to, if you will, force any administration's hand. So Congress is the legislative body in our government. Right. You are the ones that propose and adopt laws, and so I would say a robust human rights legislative agenda, so that it's beyond resolutions and statements and hearings, but as with the Sergei Magnitsky bill, which again, it was passed over opposition from the State Department, opposition from the administration, not because they don't share the goals, but they never want their hands tied. Well, Congress isn't trying to tie any particular administration's hand, but sometimes they are trying to force our government's hand in a positive way to do what we should do to pursue the goals that the administration shares, but there are always countervailing arguments. So I would say a robust legislative agenda. And most recently, the Sergei Magnitsky Act is a really good example of Congress standing firm, again, very bipartisan. The leader was Democrats and Republicans were side by side in pushing that forward in the face of opposition. It's now the law, and that's, I think, a good example of when Congress is at its best. You have a lot of power when it comes to leading the human rights agenda. It's one area of foreign policy where Congress usually leads and the administration follows. So in the spirit of, a tripartite government and co-equal branches of government, I would say do not fail to lead in the human rights sector, because you can pass laws and you can help our government do what it should already be doing.
Well, I know, and I'll finish up with this, Mr. Chairman. I know that Ambassador Powers tweeted out about Saeed Abedini, and that seemed to have an impact, I know, at least on some of my constituents who picked up on it as a very high profile. So would you say the higher the profile that we continue to, whether it's in tweets or Facebook, or the higher we continue to do that in terms of whether it be in the administration or chairmen of committees, does that make a real impact, not just with Iran, but with China, with a number of others where there are human rights violations that occur on a daily basis?
I absolutely believe that it does, and I believe my colleague Dr. Kallinger said earlier, but we have heard so much personal eyewitness testimony to this effect. Not only does it have an impact at the policy level, but it does have an impact at the level of the lives of the people who are being persecuted, who are imprisoned, who are suffering. They see it almost immediately that when somebody prominent brings up their name, when an article appears, when there is a press report, their circumstances improve for the better. There is no longer this sense of impunity. Impunity is the worst message that abusers can get. That, we can get away with this because, nobody really is paying that much attention.
Well, for those that are listening, let the name of Pastor Saeed Abedini echo through these halls of Congress today and each day until he is released, and let that message be there. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meadows. Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Abedini, I'm sorry that you have to be here. I appreciate your tenacity and your bravery and your commitment to your husband, and I just wish I could have had a chance to meet you in other circumstances. The Secretary of State came Tuesday and testified and sat right there at that table. Now, I didn't get a chance to ask questions. We ran out of time. But he made the comment that we didn't want to tie the hostages, if you will, to the nuclear negotiations. We didn't want to prejudice them. I was outraged. We should be the ones prejudiced. They should be afraid of what we might do to them, and not the other way around. To not tie these human rights violations to that regime over there, and Dr. Sweat, I want to pick up something you said. The administration doesn't want its hands tied, and Congress doesn't seek to tie the administration's hands. There's one administration we'd like to tie up probably more than just the hands of, and that's the regime in Iran. They should be afraid of how we will react, not the other way around. So for this administration to take the posture that somehow we can't bring human rights violations to the forefront in these negotiations, I'm told the Iranian people are crying out for relief. They want out from underneath this regime. The sanctions are working. Why would we give them up now? We have people that they are held, our own Americans that they have held. We should make this in the forefront. We should hold their feet to the fire and make this the absolute hallmark of our negotiations. If they want to show us they want out underneath the sanctions, if they want to be a better world neighbor, then they better start by acting like it. So I would encourage you, and I'm sure you have to put the pressure on the State Department and this administration to say that we are no longer going to be concerned with some political correctness, that somehow we're going to prejudice the Iranian regime. Are they kidding me? We need to take them to task in a major way. I'm sorry, I had to just get that off my chest. Now I have a question. Mr. Sekulow, am I pronouncing that correctly?
That's correct, Congressman.
Okay, your dad's Jay Sekulow. I've
Right.
followed y'all for a number of years, and I appreciate y'all's work.
Thank you.
Are you getting the sense that we're being able to elevate the discussion, as my colleague Mr. Meadows said, and to bring up Pastor Said's name in circles, and to make it clear and evident that we will not let this die? Are the Iranian people getting that message? Are we getting any kind of help from inside? Are you aware of that, or maybe that's a question for all of you? What say you?
Sure. Well, I would say, and because I know Congressman Deutsch did not like the word incompetent used, but as Congressman Meadows and as you just brought up as well, Congressman Weber, it's the idea that people's good work inside our government, even inside possibly the Iranian government, is at some point being undermined by higher officials. So it'd be someone like an undersecretary or a secretary of state or a foreign minister who says, we're not going to, I've got the info, I got the briefing, but we're not going to talk about this at these meetings. And so when Secretary Kerry was so clear and left nothing to, he said he has more to tell you about what their efforts are, non-nuclear related. We believe that if the sanctions fall, Said is lost.
We lose our leverage.
That's exactly. So I want to make clear that as representing the Abedini family, that we support a new sanctions regime if Iran were to, violate any of the agreements. We support those efforts by the House, and believe we missed one major opportunity, the precondition. But they are already hostages. They're already pawns. And so though the administration did miss the opportunity as a precondition to, economic relief for Iran.
They don't want their people to suffer while they have our people held in suffering.
Absolutely. They have 3 Americans held hostage, and it's our U.S. government who believes that Iran knows where Robert Levinson is. So, thank you, Congressman.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Sweat, are we getting help from inside the Iranian nation? Are they rallying? Are they paying attention? Are they taking heart from what's happening over here?
Well, I don't know that I have the answer to that question. I think that the reports would certainly indicate that the Iranian people, as you said, are desperate for relief from the sanctions regime. But something else that has been frequently reported on is that they're desperate for relief from being perceived as a pariah nation. Obviously, 75 million people, a lot of those people, the majority of those people are very good people, just like you and me. They want to be part of a legitimate country. And they are chafing not just under the economic bite of these sanctions, but under the terrible and well-deserved reputation that their nation has earned through its horrible abuses. I would say, make one point about the importance of aggressively raising the release, in particular, of these 3 Americans, and we're all very focused on Pastor Abedini today. And that's easy. That is something that Iran can do with utter and total ease. That is simply a matter of saying, done. It's like the old easy button. I can't remember which store it was that used to feature that.
It's Staples, but I don't remember it.
If they are unwilling to do something so easy, then I think we have to be concerned about their willingness to do something very hard, which is unwind a very elaborate and deceptive and deeply embedded nuclear program.
Well, you said it well. Our values, our country's values of individual freedom and religious freedom, and after all, that's why y'all are involved, we're all involved here, should be the absolute, as I said, hallmark of any of our negotiations. And to think that anything else can be different is naive. And I don't mean to cut you off, but I want to go to the good doctor down here. Do we have any information from inside Iran, and I'm coming back to you, Ms. Abedini, in just a second, that we're getting support? Our actions over here, are we making a difference?
Mr. Weber, unfortunately, I don't have specific information, but I would just reiterate one of the points Dr. Sweat made, which is that the Iranian people have made clear when they have the opportunity, for instance, in this recent Zogby poll, that they want to change their country. When they ask what's most important for them, advancing democracy, protecting civil rights, protecting and advancing the rights of women, political reform. And obviously, in that kind of context, it would improve the situation for Pastor Abedini and for all the Iranians, the 800 dissidents that are still in detention, and all the Iranians who simply want to speak their mind.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Abedini, you may or may not choose to answer this. You may check with your counselor here, but do you still have family in Iran?
Yes, I've actually been on Iranian media quite a number of times. A lot of the news medias, Voice of America and BBC and so on. And the feedback that I get, you know, the Iranian people were very much devastated when they were fighting for their human rights in 2009, and they didn't get some kind of a support. The Iranian people, are like the abused family, really is hoping that America and the world would stand up and would speak out against all these human rights violations. And the Iranian people are very much in support of that.
Okay,
I can add that.
I'm glad to hear that, and I want to associate myself with my colleagues' remarks that we're going to talk about the Pastor Saeed and you and your efforts, Ms. Abedini, too, and your children, and we're going to continue to bring this to the forefront. And much to our colleague on the other side of the aisle, when there's a failure of the administration, I will not be shy about pointing that out. And right now, they have a colossal failure, in my opinion, in trying to relieve some of these sanctions without making this in the forefront. And I've said my piece, and I'll yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weber. Mr. DeSantis.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing and bringing more attention to this. We must bring back Pastor Saeed Abedini. I think that many people have spoke eloquently about human rights, religious freedom, and all of that is absolutely true. But even if none of those issues were at stake, he's an American citizen. This is an attack not just against him and his family, but an attack against all of us. And this from a regime that's, since its very inception, has exhibited abuse after abuse, attack after attack against the U.S. and our citizens. They detained over 400 embassy personnel after the initial Islamic Revolution. They were complicit in the Beirut bombing of 1983, which killed over 200 U.S. Marines. And of course, they were coordinating and perpetrating attacks against our service members in Iraq. Not to mention, of course, the citizens of the United States, not just Pastor Saeed Abedini, but Bob Levinson, Amir Hekmati. This is something that is going to the heart of all of us, and so I want this to be an issue that is dealt with at the highest levels. And I was very discouraged when Secretary Kerry said that they had not raised the issue in the context of these nuclear negotiations, which obviously was many of the people on both sides of the aisle had some serious concerns about. But let me ask you, Ms. Abedini, you had mentioned that when you initially talked to the State Department, they said there was nothing they could do. Who was it at the State Department that basically said there was nothing they could do?
I don't think I can mention names, but I think it was at the lower, it was what's the contact?
It's a desk officer. It's Loy Howe. She was the first to state that they could not offer any assistance. And again, I mean, this is the staff level. They're getting direction from others.
And to Secretary Kerry's credit, as soon as he found out, he immediately put out a statement. But the idea that the bureaucracy would be that dismissive when you have a U.S. citizen in jeopardy like that, that's been essentially kidnapped by a totalitarian regime, there's some major issues going on there. And so I was very discouraged to read your testimony and to be reminded of the fact that you had actually gone. And I just think our bureaucracy has got to be very responsive to that. That's a very important issue. Mr. Sekulow, I guess part of this is in 2009, you had this green movement that was very promising. And so some of these countries like Egypt, you don't know what's going to end up happening. There's pluses and minuses to people like Hosni Mubarak. But when you're in Iran, it can't get any worse. So any speaking out against the regime is something that I think the U.S. should support. The administration purposely did not back that, did not provide any even rhetorical support. And I think the reason is that the president was looking to have better relations with the regime, and he thought that that would jeopardize that. And so I'm wondering, is there a concern that this zest for a deal on paper may cause the administration to not put forth as much effort on some of these human rights cases that could, quite frankly, complicate the quote-unquote deal?
Congressman DeSantis, I would say the administration did just that. I mean, they missed the preconditions to negotiations where they could have handled this with Iran before sitting down on the nuclear issue and economic relief and say, hey, you've got 3 of ours. I mean, we were talking about broader human rights in Iran. That's a long-term strategy. But why we're here today is because of 1 American of 3 who are being held. As you said, that's egregious enough. That we didn't have to have a whole agreement on a new human rights scheme inside Iran for Iranian citizens to get to the next step. We needed to get 3 Americans home, and the administration missed that opportunity. Then Secretary Kerry came before the Foreign Affairs Committee, of which his subcommittee is a part of, and said it will not be part of the nuclear negotiations. Some have said it's on the margins, but he was not really clear on if that's even the case or if he is informed of that being the case. And so what we are concerned is that this administration is so focused on appeasing Iran, who has threatened even this Congress, if you enact sanctions, new sanctions, to pull out of these agreements, that we missed the best opportunity. Iran's hurting from the sanctions, we know that. The regime hurts because of that. And yet we did not demand the return of 3 Americans, not a new human rights scheme in Iran. That is a long-term plan that Dr. Sweat and others would need to work on. I mean, but this was the return of 3 Americans, and the administration, I do believe, has sacrificed them and has betrayed them. And we've used that word because we know they had an opportunity that did not exist. I was trying to make that clear to Congressman Deutsch. That opportunity didn't exist before, Congressman DeSantis. We know that. We weren't sitting down at the table with the foreign minister of Iran. Our president wasn't on the phone. But now we are, and we're still, and this has been a problem with the State Department, our bureaucracy, we're still living in 2012 mindset that we have no diplomatic relation, when we all can read a newspaper, you don't have to have a security clearance to know that these meetings are occurring. And so, yes, we're very concerned that if we don't continue to speak out and Congress doesn't make it clear, as it has throughout this process, the only time we've gotten a response back from this administration, I'll close with this, it's never been proactive. It's reactive. When President Obama made the phone call, and then they said, well, he also brought up Said. It was the day after the 1-year anniversary of Said's imprisonment. I was at a prayer vigil outside the White House. Naghmeh was at a prayer vigil, and boy, they were happening around the country. Secretary of State Kerry, Secretary Clinton never spoke out, even with the media attention, congressional support. And then Secretary Kerry basically promised during his confirmation hearings to Senator Rubio that he would, but he didn't until after the Lantos Commission hearing. And by the way, none of that has been vocal. These have been 2 written statements from Secretary Kerry. Even when asked about it directly, he'll never use the name. And then President Obama has also not spoken out. And so at a time, and then we're told, well, because they become pawns and hostages. But Congressman Deutsch used the word himself about, he already called them. They already are hostages. And so we are extremely concerned that we missed one huge opportunity, and that, again, we would just hope that in this confidential briefing, classified briefing, to learn, so that we know from you that it's not just reactive, the public, but that there is proactive work being done, because that is not clear to us. Thank you, Congressman.
Well, thank you. And before I yield back, I just want to say I think that this needs to be a proactive priority, of course, for the Congress, but also for the administration. And I am skeptical whether you could ever deal with this Iranian regime, but the notion that you're going to get a nuclear agreement with a regime who will not even return a pastor who's wrongly imprisoned, give me a break. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I yield back.
Well put, Mr. DeSantis, and thank you, Mr. Weber, for your very strong intervention as well. Just, and if you have any further questions, I'll yield to you, but just one final couple of thoughts. Mr. Levinson is an elderly, 65-year-old man, suffers from diabetes. And as I think all of you have said, we're talking about three individuals. The primary focus today, obviously, is on Pastor Abedini. There is a great fear for his life. And it seems to me, what happens to the nuclear negotiations if he is killed? I hate to be so blunt, but what happens? The whole bright light of scrutiny will be brought to bear on one missed opportunity after another. And frankly, if Frank Wolf had not held that hearing in March, there would have been no statement of concern even then. And again, Mrs. Abedini, when we all heard you testify at Mr. Wolf's hearing, it was powerful. And we all thought, give it time, the administration, give them time. Just parenthetically, last week, I held a hearing on human rights abuses in China. It was my 49th hearing on human rights abuses in China. We had 5 daughters of political prisoners testifying on behalf of their dads. They were eloquent beyond words, compassionate, and they loved their dads, who are in prison being tortured in Beijing. Vice President Biden was there at the time, and we repeatedly asked him to raise their names. Hasn't happened. That's the kind of thing. Human rights cannot be put somewhere in the back and expect to see progress on it. If we prioritize it, they will prioritize it. And as you said, Dr. Lantos-Sweat, this is a very easy thing for the Iranians to do. Pastor Abedini can be on the plane home tonight if they make that decision. And we're admonishing the administration. And we've been doing it, all of us, quietly after the hearing that was held by Frank Wolf. We've been saying, just do it. We're with you. I couldn't have been, and the others, including Congressman Wolf, couldn't have been more outspoken in thanking Secretary Kerry for raising the case, but now do it in a way that is most likely to lead to a positive outcome, and that is his release, because we're all deeply worried and concerned about his well-being and his health. Mr. Weber, anything you want to say? I would like to give all 4 of you, if you'd like, to say any final comments before we close down the hearing. Okay. Thank you so very much, and we will continue on, and thankfully it will be done in a bipartisan way. The hearing is adjourned.